Aerodinosaur is proud to introduce a new propliner book by me, John Andrew Reed, now available on Amazon.com, entitled Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans. This book is 388 pages long and features 64 full narrative chapters with over 280 black and white photographs, complete with detailed captions. The bulk of the story and most of the photographs have never been published before. All this for only $24.95. Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans helps the reader make sense of a perplexing era in North American aviation. The chapters are in chronological order, beginning in the early 1960s, consisting of first- and second-hand stories about obsolete propliner, passenger, and freight operations that continued long after the dawn of the jetliner age, well past their technological prime and intended use into the early 2000s. If you like stories about the overextended use of DC-6s, DC-7s, Lockheed Constellations and Electras, Martin 404s, Convair liners, and Curtiss C-46s, and the unique personalities that flew them, this is where you will find it all. The stories behind many of our Aerodinosaur videos on this channel are found in this book. The reader will experience this era through my own experiences and through the eyes of some of the key people who operated and flew propliners during this time period, mainly out of St. Louis, Kansas City, Detroit, and the infamous Corrosion Corner at Miami International Airport, flying passengers, general freight, automotive freight, and overnight courier freight. You'll experience the prevalence of lax air regulations during that time and the resultant operator corner cutting that caused both high and low profile propliner disasters involving sports celebrities and teams, rock stars, and freight dog crews. You will also learn how one of the rare legitimate operators of old propliners, who had the largest DC-6 fleet in the world during this era, impacted airline deregulation after 1978 and changed the airline industry forever. We delve equally into the technical and historical details of the airplanes and unravel this otherwise confusing era. I could go on forever about what is packed into this book, but instead of more of that, check out Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans for only $24.95 at Amazon.com. In part one of our Poor Man's Hangar Tour series, we covered the early, lower horsepower, heavy radial engines, including the Pratt & Whitney R-1820 Wasp, developing up to 600 horsepower, and then its fallback R-985 Wasp Jr., developing up to 450 horsepower. We featured footage of two of the best-known aircraft that utilized these engines, which included the North American AT-6 Texan using the Wasp, and the twin Beechcraft Model 18 with the Wasp Jr. We now begin to move up the horsepower food chain to feature the next level of power, the early version 9-cylinder single row Curtiss Wright R-1820, developing from 575 horsepower in the beginning to most notably 1,200 horsepower during World War II. Hi, John Reed, Aerodinosaur. We will feature footage of the two best-known aircraft that utilize the 1,200 horsepower engine, including a version of the Douglas DC-3 transport and the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bomber of World War II. As with all heavy radial engines, the definitive R-1820 required a geared internal supercharger, and with the B-17, the addition of a bulky external exhaust-driven turbocharger, which allowed operations at high altitudes above 30,000 feet. In a later episode, we will cover the more powerful redesigned post-war versions of this engine and the post-war aircraft they powered. The more advanced R-1820 developed 1,350 horsepower to 1,525 horsepower in the post-war years. The remainder of this series, involving a planned 8 or so more episodes, will lead all the way up to the 28-cylinder 4-row Pratt & Whitney R-4360 Wasp Major of 3,800 horsepower, as found in the Convair B-36 Peacemaker strategic bomber and the Douglas C-124C Globemaster II military transport. Development concepts leading to the R-1820 Cyclone began as far back as 1925, with the engine entering production in the 1931 and 1932 timeframe, with the definitive original design ceasing production in the mid-1940s at the end of World War II. The redesigned, more powerful post-war variants just mentioned saw production into the late 1950s. Cylinder bore diameter was 6.125 inches, and the piston stroke was 6.875 inches. The 6.125-inch bore became Curtiss Wright's standard cylinder inside diameter for all subsequent more powerful engines they designed and built, such as the 1,900 horsepower R-2600 with 2 rows and 14 cylinders, and the 2,200 horsepower to 3,700 horsepower R-3350 with 2 rows and 18 cylinders, both with a slightly shortened stroke. We will not name or describe all the aircraft the earliest Cyclones powered, but these photos give you an idea. The earliest F-Series versions of the R-1820 developed from 575 horsepower to 900 horsepower at 2350 RPM for a variety of early 1930s aircraft, and the G-Series developed 1,000 horsepower by 1937. But the definitive G-Series engine developed 1,200 horsepower at 2,500 RPM as found on many DC-3s and most B-17s. During the war, Studebaker built the vast majority of R-1820Gs for the B-17. These horsepower rating increases were attained mainly with increased fuel octane ratings to 91 grade, coupled with finer cooling fins with much greater cooling area cast into the aluminum cylinder heads. Also, second-order vibration dampeners were added to the crankshaft to dampen torsional crankshaft vibration. Without these, crankshafts would fail at high horsepower RPM settings. Many DC-3s and C-47s were powered by the 1,200 horsepower G-Series R-1820, but most were powered by the favored 2-row 14-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R-1830 of the same horsepower. We've adequately summarized the development of the Douglas DC-3 and military C-47 in our earlier airline industry takeoff videos, namely Part 3 entitled The Douglas DC-3, Origins and Triumph, and also Part 4 entitled Douglas C-47s Everywhere. Please refer to those videos if you want the background on this aircraft that changed the world, so to speak, which includes some great taxi and flyby operations. Here's an R-1820G powered C-47 in operations at Oshkosh, 2019. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was the definitive and most well-known application of the 1,200 horsepower R-1820G Cyclone Radial aircraft engine, which was among the first of the big U.S. production radials to exceed 1,000 horsepower on takeoff, and the first application for the external exhaust-driven turbocharger in a bomber for high-altitude performance. I will only briefly summarize its history here, and then we'll present a series of ground and flyby operations I shot that occurred from 1993 to the present day, which represents a span of 30 years. After a very rough development period, starting in 1935, this plane was built in great numbers to become the U.S. Army's 8th Air Force heavy strategic bomber most responsible for pounding Nazi Germany into defeat while operating out of multiple bases in England. It was a rugged design that could take severe turbulence and battle damage better than most, but many were unfortunately blown out of the sky due to heavy flak, as well as Germany's defensive fighter fleets. Compared to similar bombers, such as the consolidated B-24 Liberator, the Luftwaffe fighter pilots often required multiple passes to shoot down a B-17, certainly nerve-wracking for B-17 crews. In the post-war years, stripped-out B-17 served with the U.S. and foreign militaries into the early 1960s in a wide variety of roles. In those post-war years, limited numbers found the civilian market and were converted to passenger-carrying transports for private operators, as well as several firebomber conversions into the 1970s for wildfire and forest fire suppression. Just as a point of reference, the B-17 had a crew of 8 to 10 men and a maximum bomb load of 9,600 pounds. There were 12 defensive 50 caliber guns in the nose, tail, waist, and upper and lower turrets, and normal maximum gross weight was 56,000 pounds and higher for war emergency. It could fly 300 miles an hour at 25,000 feet and had a service ceiling as high as today's modern jetliners. Of course, as with everything else in aviation and many other areas, there are trade-offs when it comes to these loosely thrown out statistics. Over 12,700 B-17s were built, two-thirds of them G models, before production ended at the war's end in 1945. They were not only manufactured by Boeing, but also Douglas and Lockheed shared in the production. A few of the later versions of the B-17, mainly the H model, were fitted or retrofitted with the redesigned, more powerful R-1820 Cyclones, developing 1,350 horsepower, which, as mentioned, will be the starting point for our discussion on the advanced R-1820 in a later episode of this series. These days, quite a few B-17s fly the airshow circuit, but since 2019, 2 of them have been destroyed in fatal accidents. Our video clips to follow contain videos of both of these aircraft in their airshow heydays. The Collins Foundation B-17-909 crashed on October 3, 2019 during a living history experience passenger ride at Windsor Locks, Connecticut, killing 2 crew and 5 out of the 10 paying passengers. Then, on November 12, 2022, the Commemorative Air Force's B-17 Texas Raiders was blasted out of the airshow pattern when a P-63 King Cobra fighter hit it at a Dallas air show, killing the single pilot of the King Cobra and 5 in the B-17. All were experienced, loved, and admired legacy aviation professionals. This video includes some footage of 909 in operation and a lot more footage of Texas Raiders. While certainly not a direct involvement, I had a 40-year on and off relationship with Texas Raiders, as countless other enthusiasts did. For me, starting in 1983. That year, she participated in a commemorative Air Force air show, then called the Confederate Air Force, at my home airport, Spirit of St. Louis Airport, out of which I regularly flew a Cessna 182 Turbo Skylane RG and other general aviation aircraft at the time. After that 1983 air show, B-17 Texas Raiders was stuck at our airport for a month waiting for parts because of a significant mechanical failure at the end of the show. On a few occasions, after my buddies and I concluded our flying activities for the afternoon, we would first go to the airport watering hole, pick up some beers, and go back to the apron to drink them while climbing onto the wing, peering into the cockpit area, and sitting on the wing of Texas Raiders, with our feet dangling over the leading edge between number 3 and 4 engines, right in front of the control tower. Of course, we thoughtfully avoided the no-step areas on the wing. Perhaps we shouldn't have been so casually crawling around someone else's private property while drinking beer, but this is what happened, and nobody, including airport personnel, ever hassled us. While on the wing drinking beer, I would have never guessed the terrible fate of Texas Raiders nearly 40 years later. Essentially, that type of idle activity was tolerated on many airport ramps in those days, but those good old days are long gone. As I mentioned, since those days in 1983, I took video of Texas Raiders on many occasions at air shows. Only hours after the November 2022 mid-air tragedy, on YouTube, I noticed all kinds of so-called tributes and remembrances to Texas Raiders and the ill-fated crew, resulting in millions of immediate views for some of them. This Aerodinosaur channel could have probably done the same. Regardless of other creators' good intentions or otherwise, we were concerned we might be perceived as monetizing on someone else's horrible misfortune, so we passed on that opportunity. It was simply my personal choice. I would also like to point out that I'm old enough to have known and even to have worked with several former World War II heavy bombardment B-17 combat pilots and even a waist gunner, the latter a thankless sitting duck type job. Those men I knew very rarely opened up about being shot up and seeing their friends blown out of the sky over Germany, which certainly adversely affected their personal and family lives pretty much for the rest of their lives. At least 2 of my B-17 friends sometimes exhibited strange but mild characteristics similar to what is today known as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. When you look at the horrible video and photos of the Texas Raiders midair, you need to remember that B-17 scenes like this happened every day at 30,000 feet over Germany, making those crews wonder if they were next, so to speak, or if they would be lucky enough to simply limp hundreds of miles back to base with a load of shot-up control cables, an unstable airplane, and seriously wounded and dead crew carnage. In conclusion, as shocked as we all might be every time we think of the surrealistic and sickening Dallas Air Show accident, remember that World War II B-17 combat crews had to accept real-time scenes like that as perfectly normal every day. So remember that two-edged legacy of the B-17 and its brave crews: the defeat of Hitler and the horrific cost, as you view the following video clips.
We have a B-17 and B-24 from the airport. Texas Raiders gentlemen, we ask you all please to rise as we are going to have the missing man formation and task.
Attacks everywhere, bringing the economy that sustained cover. The B-17 approaches, and the bomb bay doors come open. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be recovering all of our warbirds here with the exception of the Connie. He's going to do another air show, I believe. There's